is able to come and speak to us. She is an expert on the Middle East and was very had a lot of contact with the government and everything dealing with the Arab Spring and a lot of things that are going on in the Middle East. And she is also she's the director and the senior fellow of the Sabin Center for the Middle East Policy Group at the Brookings Institution. And of course, she was well, you all have her bio. Has had a very impressive career, and we're so happy to have you here. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thanks everyone, and I understand this is the 4th day of a week-long seminar, and so your brains are probably just packed, and so I really don't want to lecture. I really don't want to lecture. What I would like to do, though, is try and have a little bit of a conversation with you about the Arab awakening, because when you have events that momentous, that may or may not be, affecting the kids in your class either because of the images that they see on TV or even because of family and friends living in that part of the world, it's always a struggle. How do you bring the news into the classroom in a way that speaks to your students, but that also gets at broader themes, right? And then when it comes to the Middle East, I know as somebody who's taught on the Middle East at the university level, on and off over the years, it's always a challenge to figure out, am I putting things in the right context? Am I phrasing things the right way? Am I being sufficiently culturally sensitive in various ways? And it's always a challenge to figure out, how do we teach about the Middle East? So what I'd really like to do is say first, my expertise, at least over the last 8 or 10 years of my career, has been on Arab political and economic reform. That's what I worked on as a scholar before I went into government. That's what I worked on for the State Department over 2.5 years. I left the State Department at the end of January and came back to the Brookings Institution. And so I was working the Arab awakening from within the State Department. Sort of all the things that I've been studying came to life. And so I would love to talk to you about this issue, about how you are bringing it into the classroom, about how you're thinking about bringing it into the classroom, issues, questions, challenges, as you think about that, but also other Middle East topics, if you like, wide open. So maybe a way to start is, if it's okay with you, is for me to gather some questions or issues from you, and if we can sort of gather some of those up, and then I'll try and give you some comments, and we can have a little back and forth. Does that work? I think that might be more interesting than just... Please.
I guess one of the things that I always struggle with is sort of even just defining, quite honestly, the Middle East, because it seems to be a changing, malleable thing. Mm-hmm. And so I guess what is your view on what the Middle East is in terms of geography? And
sure.
And not just geography, but culture and language and religion. How would you define it?
Sure. Okay.
One of the issues that I have when discussing conflicts and issues in the Middle East, particularly when it involves Israel and Palestine, are students who come with a great wealth of biblical or religious knowledge, and that seems to dominate a mentality.
Mm-hmm.
You can't argue against somebody's
religious truth,
or religious point of view, but at the same time, you also want to maybe present a different point of view. So how do you sort of walk that line, keep that balance?
Right. So how do you sort of respect where people are coming from in terms of their personal faith or their community that they're rooted in, but then introduce context and perspective in the classroom? Sure. Yeah.
Literature from the Middle East. Something that a high school student could relate to.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes?
How to decipher what they're reading in the news in terms of keeping current and understanding. I do a lot of point of view and who's presenting which side.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very hard given the media. I mean, I know we have more access now through the internet, but still, how do you present kind of a balance for these different sides?
Sure, and the broader challenge here, I know from my own teaching, is when your kids are using the internet as an information source, how do they decode the bias of the person who's writing they're looking at, right? How do they understand that if they don't yet know enough about the topic to understand the argument that they're in the middle of? So, yeah.
Sometimes I guess it's hard for my students is sort of analyzing U.S. national interests with different Middle Eastern countries. But they seem to perceive that a lot of times our economic interests always win out and cause us to turn a blind eye to some of our ideological interests, like women's rights in Saudi Arabia or Bahrain repressing their people and their undemocratic government. So how do we help them make sense of all of that without just there being the perception that we're oil mongers?
Right, and the broader sort of interest values, are those things that we're trading off in our international relations, which is, an issue that you could talk about not just with respect to the Middle East, but a lot of our foreign policy issues, but definitely a perennial topic for discussion. Okay, good. Well, those are a bunch of good things to start. Maybe what I'll start with is talk a little bit about how we can define the Middle East, or maybe better, how can we sort of what categories can we put it in as a region, so that we can think about it in the broader context of what you may be teaching over the course of the year, and talk a little bit from there about some of the underlying issues in the region that are driving the events that we see in the news, and how might we bring those alive, either through literature or through helping kids engage with opinion or things like that. And I think that'll also let us get to some of the specific issues that were raised. So, broadly speaking, for those of us who work on the policy side, we tend to define the region along the same lines that our government defines the region, because we're trying to talk to them. So I think, broadly speaking, we think of the Middle East as stretching from Morocco across North Africa, including the countries of the Levant, so Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Israel, okay, and then the Arabian Peninsula countries, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman, the Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, and Iran and Iraq. Now, there are a lot of other ways one could think about it. The Arab League is 22 countries that include countries like Sudan and Djibouti that we think of as African countries, and Mauritania on the other side of the continent. And then there's Turkey. Is Turkey a part of the Middle East, or is Turkey a part of Europe? And that's actually a subject that gets debated in Turkey a lot. So as a political definition, you can look at the Arab world, okay, the Arab-speaking countries, which would include the 22 members of the Arab League. You can think of North Africa, the Levant, and the Gulf as sort of three sub-regions that make up together the Middle East. But I think there's probably consensus that you're heading into other parts of the world is Afghanistan and Pakistan in the east, that would fall into the category of South Asia, and both politically and historically, while they certainly have ties to the Middle East, have ties to the subcontinent and to Central Asia much more tightly. And then on the other end, Africa below the Sahara, as sort of a separate political, historical region, although, again, historically and culturally, there's a lot of influence. So, I said I spent the last decade or so of my professional life focused on the Arab world. What I really mean by that is not that I know all 22 countries of the Arab League, but that I've been focusing my attention on North Africa, the Levant, the Arabian Peninsula. And I wouldn't even say I know that much about Iraq, because especially over the last decade or so, Iraq has been a full-time job, I think, if you really want to understand what's going on in that very volatile and complex society. So that's in terms of sort of broad definition. Is that helpful?
All the way over to Morocco.
All the way over to Morocco. Yeah, and you know, I think it's, look, I'm a political scientist, so I tend to think about defining the region mainly in terms of politics and the relationships between these countries, both at the government-to-government level and at the societal level. And I think if you look at the Arab awakening, it's actually notable that you saw contagion effects or demonstration effects, if you will, all across that band of North African countries, in the Levant, in the Arabian Peninsula. You didn't see it much outside except for Sudan, where there is quite a lot of connection between activists as well as between the governments. So that's in terms of broad definition. So maybe what I can do now is talk to you a little bit about some of the broader trends that I think if you look at the dramatic events of the Arab awakening, of revolutions and civil wars and uprisings, what was driving, what are the common threads that help to explain these uprisings emerging in so many places so quickly? It was almost as though there must have been a lot of tinder there, because when a spark was lit, the fire went up in a lot of places. So I guess I would identify 3 underlying trends, some of which are global trends, not specific to the region, that I think we can look to kind of help explain the change that's underway. The first is specific to the region, and it's demographics, simple demographics. Essentially, in the last 10, 15 years, the Arab world has undergone a baby boom that puts our baby boom, leaves it in the dust. Half the Arab world today is under 30. And in specific countries, the youth skew is even more dramatic. In Saudi Arabia, with about 20 million people, half of those 20 million people are under 15. In Egypt, 1/3 of Egypt's 82 million people are between 15 and 29. So that's like half a generation, or one generation is 1/3 of the population. And, you know, when you have a lot of young people in your society, that can be a resource, that can be a source of growth. If those young people are well educated, if they're provided with the social services and the health care and the things that they need to become productive when they reach adulthood. But there's no question that providing those things is expensive for governments and societies. It can be a drain when people are young. And so even wealthy societies in the Arab world have found a challenge in trying to gather the resources to invest in this young population. And this young population at the same time they are, for the most part, healthier, better educated than previous generations. Over the last 30 or 40 years in the Arab world, child mortality rates are down, literacy is up, all those basic indicators of development. And so this young generation feels as though it should have wider opportunities than its parents. But the gap between their aspirations and the reality of the opportunities that confront them is vast. And this gets to some of the other trends that I will point to. And so just to take one small example, unemployment, which in and of itself is unfortunately afflicting many societies, including developed Western societies right now. But youth unemployment in the Arab world is at historic levels. Not just in the double digits, but 20%, 30%, 50% of young people in these societies don't have regular jobs. So, they got an education in many of these countries. If they passed the high school matriculation exam, they were guaranteed a state-provided university education, and they went and they did that and found themselves unemployable. And so again, the gap between expectation and reality is just huge. So these are young people who want more from life. They can't get a job, and in these societies, getting a job, not having a job doesn't just mean you're not earning money. It means you can't move out of your parents' house. In a society like Egypt, where it takes the average family 2 years to save up the costs of marriage, it means you can't get married for God knows how long. And because many people in these societies are traditional, you're not dating. So it sort of puts your whole life on hold, not having a job. And it keeps you caught in this, you're not a child, but you're not fully an adult, and you're not a full participant in society. You're still a subject of your parents. Yes?
Is there a large amount of immigration between these young folk and other Arab countries looking for work?
There has been from poorer Arab countries to richer Arab countries for a long time, and remittances back are very important sources of income. In Egypt, for example, a lot of educated Egyptians go to the Gulf to work. But as the global economic downturn hit, even the wealthier Gulf societies, were feeling some effects. And so there was some return. And remittances were down, and so it sort of had a double effect on an economy like Egypt's. Global food prices are up, economic growth is down, and your migrant workers are returning. So you really get hit. Yes?
What about the status of women?
Yes, that is important, and let me come to that in a minute, if I may. Let me briefly, if I can, just outline a couple other broader trends, because I think you'll see that these three interact in important ways, and then we can talk a little more. So the second trend is economic. Okay, I talked about unemployment, but even in societies where the economy was growing, Egypt before the revolution had a reasonable growth rate, around 5 or 6%. Tunisia, at the macroeconomic level, was growing at 9% before the revolution. But the growth was very unequal, uneven. Why? Because of corruption. These are autocratic governments. They're not accountable. They're not transparent. In the countries where most national wealth comes out of the ground in the form of oil, that's controlled by the government, and wealth flows down from the top. Well, over time, if wealth is supposed to flow down from the top in an unaccountable, non-transparent manner, it's going to get hung up along the way. And so even in oil-rich societies, the mechanism for distributing social goods and rent across society became more and more inefficient. And so grievances about inequality, which was on the rise across the region, and corruption helped to drive these revolutions.
So much for trickle down, huh?
So much for trickle down. Well, it wasn't the same trickle down theory as here. There is a really important difference between governments that rely on taxation and governments that don't need to tax because they just suck money up out of the ground in terms of public accountability. So that's the second trend. Then the third trend relates to media and the information environment. And you've probably read and heard a lot about these being Twitter revolutions. But when I talk about the media here, I'm actually talking even about old new media, things like satellite television or the simple World Wide Web as a source for information and a way of communicating with people. Before you even get to Twitter and Facebook, you had a changed information environment. With the advent of Arab satellite TV, things like Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya, all of a sudden people weren't dependent anymore on the government as the official source of information. And they could learn more about what was going on in countries next door, the village down the road, or countries that they had always thought of as their peers. If you were a young Egyptian and you were raised in school, your social studies class taught you about Gamal Abdel Nasser, the founder of the non-aligned movement, along with Nehru and Suharto. And then you find out that India and Indonesia are economically going gangbusters, and Egypt is stuck. Well, that's going to have a powerful impact on your sense of how your country is doing and where you are. And so the change in the information environment had a powerful impact too, and then these new media technologies allowed people to organize in new ways as well. So it's the combination of this youth bulge, these underlying economic dysfunctions that produced grievance, and a media environment that gave people more information and more tools to organize. And these three trends, I have to say, have been building in the region for a decade or more. These are not sudden. So a lot of us were following these things and saying, well, it's harder and harder for governments to maintain control in this changed environment. But I don't think any of us really expected that it was going to explode the way it did. I want to get into more of a back and forth. Someone raised the issue of women and women's status. We can also talk about religion and the role of religion in what's taking place in the region right now. And this can let us get into a little bit of what do we expect and how do religious perspectives inform some of the other issues that we discussed, the Arab-Israeli conflict. Rather than me kind of continuing to pontificate, why don't we open it up? Tell me a little bit, when you raise the issue of women, what's the question or the concern at the heart there?
Well, from talking to students that have come over from that area, they say women are still second and in some cases third-class citizens over there. And they would go down a whole list. They have to, in some places they have to be covered from head to foot. Some cases they can't go out with friends unless there's a male accompanying them. They are under the control of any male in the house. If the father's not there, then the brother or uncle or whatever. And when they come over here, they say it's like a breath of fresh air that they're allowed, that they have more freedom. And yet, some of the students that I've spoken to, some of the female students that I've spoken to, actually prefer that over there because it's very structured. They know where their place is, rather than here where their parents and them get into arguments over how much freedom they should have.
Yeah. And because they don't know what the rules are,
mm-hmm.
right, and they don't know where the red lines are, even for their family members. So yeah, the kinds of restrictions that you're describing on women's autonomy really exist primarily in Saudi Arabia, where those rules, having to be fully covered when you're out in public, being under the guardianship of a male relative, those are written into law in Saudi Arabia, and the system of male guardianship is designed to prevent women from mixing with men to whom they're not married or related. And it is certainly the most extreme example of interpretation and application of Islamic religious law to gender relations.
I thought Iran would...
I'll tell you, Iran imposes a certain degree of public piety, especially on women in terms of dress. But in terms of their behavior and their legal status, it's not as bad as Saudi Arabia. In Saudi Arabia, a woman can't have her own bank account. She can't drive a car. She can't pass citizenship to her children. She can't even sign a medical release form. Like, you all send your kids to camp and you sign a form saying if he has an accident, you can treat him. Moms can't sign that in Saudi Arabia. So that is an extreme case, and it is upsetting.
Yet aren't a lot of women in universities?
Yes, well, so this is the flip side, is that while you have that legal status and in Saudi Arabia and lesser challenges elsewhere in terms of women's legal equality, and you have broader cultural norms that are quite conservative with respect to gender relations, you also have, especially over the last generation, education and empowerment of women socially in other ways. So across the region, actually, women are a majority of the university students. And indeed, and actually this is true in the US now too, young women score higher on college entrance exams than young men. They get into some of the most selective programs. I was in Oman a few years ago, and someone at the university there told me that their computer science department actually had to set aside a quota for men to be computer science majors, because otherwise none of them would get in, because the women just score that much higher on the exam. Now, partly this is because they don't have any distractions. But it is also a measure of, first of all, slowly changing social norms. The fact that women's education is more valued and that an educated woman is considered a more desirable person to have in your household. And this is also driven by the economy, because when you're struggling economically, you can't sort of insist on a one-income family. And so even in Saudi Arabia, when I talk to friends there in sort of middle class and upper middle class social strata, they'll say, yeah, I want my daughter to get an engineering degree. I want her to get a good job. That's how she'll get a good husband. So the social norms are changing. Yes, ma'am.
So as we have like this class of educated women, what do you think that means for like the future of the country in terms of changing the political system and getting more access? I mean, I can't imagine that it's not going to change because of that.
Yeah, well, I think this is one manifestation of the broader trends, which is that all of these underlying social trends I've been talking about create demand for change. Okay, people are saying what we've got is not working to give us what we expect and what we need and what we deserve. And that's what these revolutions were about. It was a demand for dignity. I want the government to treat me like a person, like a citizen, not like a subject. Freedom. I want greater choice in my life about where to live and where to work and who to marry and so on. And opportunity. I want more opportunities that I see other young people around the world having. And so I think young women are a big part of that. And I think you saw that in the revolutions. I mean, one of the frustrations, frankly, among young Egyptian women is that many of them were very involved in organizing and sustaining the protests last January and February. I have one young friend who, when she was in her mid-20s, helped organize a nationwide strike in 2008 in support of some striking textile workers. And she became known as the Facebook girl, because she organized this protest on Facebook. She was thrown in jail, etc. Well, she came out a hardened activist and founded with some friends something that became the April 6th movement that organized the protests in Egypt last January 25th. Since the revolution, these women feel like they've been shunted to the side as traditional politicians, almost exclusively male, have come to the fore. And the women's NGOs in Egypt in particular are saying, when the Constitution's written, women have to have a voice. And this new parliament, even if it's dominated by men who are from these religiously conservative movements, have to take into consideration the gains that we've made on women's issues in the last generation. We can't throw that out. So this is the struggle that's taking place now.
Is there any organizing among women from different Arab countries that are trying to sort of network and help support each other in their respective countries? Maybe perhaps like Saudi women appealing to other women that do have more access and sort of figure out what they need to do to make that happen in their country? Like, is there any kind of that networking going on?
There's a lot of networking going on, some of it more formal, some of it less formal. The internet and Twitter and social media are amazing, actually, that way. So when a Saudi woman named Manal al-Sharif last year videotaped herself driving a car and put it up on YouTube, she got an outpouring of support from all across the Arab world and all around the world. That's less formal. More formal is how do you learn from one another how to advocate effectively, how to lobby effectively, how do you build grassroots support for the policy agenda that you want. Or business women have a very strong network across the region, and that's something that I helped to support when I was in the State Department. So I think these things are building. Yes?
I don't want to teach comparative revolutions, and you go back to the French Revolution and you talk about women out there and throughout history, unless we look at the communist revolution, the women are a part of movement for change and then get shunned aside. And we certainly saw that with Iran. And I guess what keeps coming back to, how much do you think what is happening in Egypt and the other countries is going to mirror what happened in Iran, where there was that period where there was going to be a more moderate, perhaps, government, and then they ended up with such a stringent autocracy that really took away rights from them?
Yeah, well, and if any of you have read Shireen Ebadi's memoir, that's a wonderful portrait. She was somebody who, as a human rights lawyer, supported the revolution and briefly was a judge, right? And then was stripped of her professional role, her political role, her social role, and forced into being a dissident, basically. Yes?
Would the election in Egypt, how will that affect, once it's finally announced, how will that affect Syria in any way that you can tell us?
Yeah, let me come back to that in just a minute, if I may, just because somebody mentioned literature before. And so on this issue, it sounds like there's a lot of interest on women's issues. So I would point to Shireen Ebadi's memoir as a good, fairly, not heavy to read, really engaging personal story on Iran. And then Persepolis, the graphic novel, and Persepolis 2. Some of the content, if you're teaching in a more conservative community, might be a little tough, but I think it's well worthwhile. It's also a movie now. Those are both about Iran.
How do you spell the first author's name?
Shireen, S-H-I-R-I-N, and her last name is Ebadi, E-B-A-D-I. She won the Nobel Prize 2 years ago for her human rights work. And then, so those are both on Iran. And on the the Arab world, I mean, there's a tremendously rich literature, and it's sort of, depending on what issues you want to bring into the classroom, you could choose from a huge variety of books. I mean, if you want to talk about colonialism and the impact of colonialism, that's one set.
Cultural awareness, cultural diversity, and cultural awareness.
Okay. I mean, I don't know that I have things at the tip of my tongue, but
I thought the symmetry was pretty good.
Okay. There are definitely some good novels that deal with issues of cultural diversity or memoirs, for example, of Jews or Christians who grew up in Arab countries. There's a wonderful book written by a friend of mine, which is not a novel, but it's got a strong narrative, written by my friend Marwan Washer, who was the foreign minister of Jordan. It's a memoir of his political career, but he also grew up in a prominent Christian family in Jordan. And so it deals somewhat with the issues of cultural diversity inside Jordan, the tension between the Bedouin elite, tribal elite, and the urban Christian community. It also deals with peace process issues because he was very involved in peace process diplomacy. And it's called, yikes, I can't remember the third something, but it's Marwan Muasher, M-U-A-S-H-E-R. And, there are a couple of resources I guess I would send you to on choosing Arabic literature for the classroom. One is the Middle East Policy Council. and the other is the Middle East Institute. They've both spent some time thinking about this, and they may even have just lists that they can give you.
I am using an anthology called Santa Claus in Baghdad, where the title story of this anthology is about the fact that the educational system has been so decimated by war that this one young boy obviously has ADHD and is not able to be classified. And an uncle comes from the United States, and the mother takes the bottle of cough medicine and just doses him with it, so that he will just calm down.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's using a personal story to really reveal the impact of conflict on the society and the social infrastructure. Okay, so and then there are certainly resources you can draw on to talk about autocracy and dictatorship and rights and the impact on individuals of living under that kind of system. There's a wonderful and relatively quick read too called "In the Country of Men" by Hisham Matar, M-A-T-A-R, about growing up as a young boy in Libya. And his father, so he's writing this from the perspective of a 7 or 8 year old kid, and his father was secretly engaged in plotting against Gaddafi and disappears for several weeks. And it's sort of the story of the impact on the family and on him as a young boy. So that's another one I can point you to. Maybe we could spend a few minutes talking about some of the political issues. You raised the Egyptian election, the Syrian civil war, which I'm sure is going to continue, unfortunately, into the fall to garner a lot of attention, the Arab-Israeli conflict. And, there are a lot of, I think as a society, and certainly here in the Washington policy community, people are struggling with how to interpret what they see, and whether to be hopeful, whether to be pessimistic, whether to be anxious, and what, if anything, can the United States do constructively in a very volatile region and an environment of tremendous uncertainty, where you see the potential for the fulfillment of aspirations that are common to all of humanity, but you also see the potential for a lot of illiberal outcomes. And if you teach the history of revolutions, then you know that sometimes they can go off the rails. So I guess what I would say is, number one, I think comparative study can be really useful because one of the policy challenges we face is not looking at any given development on any given day, one election or one demonstration, and declaring success or failure on the basis of that. If you look at the history of revolutions and if you look at the history of democratic transitions, you see that they occur over a very long timeline. And that democratic transitions can almost never proceed in a linear manner. They often face setbacks. And that fundamentally what we're dealing with in these societies is the old rules having been ruptured, okay, people having broken through the barrier of fear created by autocratic governments that used repression to control. But there aren't new rules for how people interact politically. In the meantime, there is still politics. There's a lot of politics going on. And I think, what I find helpful is to look at these actors, whether it's the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, this guy who just got elected president, or a secular liberal protester, or a military general. And instead of thinking about them in identity terms, who are they, where did they come from, what do they say their beliefs are, I try to think about them as political actors. What are their interests? What are their preferences? And how do those interests and preferences interact with the other actors in the society? And so, fundamentally in Egypt, yes, you have a guy who just got elected president from the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a movement with an 80-year history in Egypt, with a very conservative ideology, with some very anti-Western attitudes, with some very regressive attitudes on women. But it is a movement that, for the first time in its history, is facing the prospect of having real authority. And so all of that ideology and all of those policy positions now meet 82 million hungry, frustrated, impatient Egyptians. And so I try to think about the impact of this movement's emergence through the ballot box as, okay, they know if they want to succeed, they have to somehow address these constituencies, just like a member of Congress or a city councilman. And I try to think about it in those terms. So I think that's one lens that I use. I think the other thing I try to keep in mind is that even though there were these underlying social phenomena that drove common events in a lot of places, each of these countries does have a unique history, a unique political culture, and it's going to evolve in its own way. And so I try not to, even though the party that won the most seats in the Tunisian parliament has its roots in the Muslim Brotherhood, and so does the Freedom and Justice Party in Egypt, and there are Muslim Brotherhood guys fighting the regime in Syria, and Hamas in Gaza also came out of the Muslim Brotherhood originally, but actually they're all operating in very different ways, and they're making very different choices. In Tunisia, this Islamist movement is in coalition with two liberal secular parties. In Gaza, Hamas is not only a political movement, but a militant movement that uses violence to achieve its goals. And in Syria, after being in political exile and committing itself to nonviolence, the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood is supporting an armed insurgency. So they're all making political choices based on their specific circumstances.
Do you think Assad has much more time? Do you think that, well, from the pressure that he's getting from the U.S. to step down, I don't know if any other countries are pressuring him to step down, but do you think he's got that much more time?
If all it took were united pressure to get him to step down, he would be gone by now, because there is quite a wide coalition of countries that have imposed sanctions and called for him to leave. In fact, the United States has had sanctions on Syria for a lot of years because it was a state sponsor of terrorism, and so we didn't have that many more sanctions we could add. But the Europeans and others have added a lot of sanctions on him and on specific individuals within the regime. Unfortunately, I don't think that's enough to get him out.
He's got Iran, he's got Russia.
He's got Iran, he's got Russia, yes, and what that means, because he's got Russia, is no action in the Security Council, right? So no collective statement with the moral and legal weight of the international community saying what you have done violates international peace and security. And that's an obstacle. That doesn't mean that there couldn't be some coalition of the willing that would undertake more active efforts to get him out, but we've been down that road. It's a long and complicated road, and it's some.
Perhaps merely increases the chance of his assassination.
Well, I think fundamentally, if you're Bashar al-Assad, this is an existential struggle, right? There's no future for you unless you can win. Now, maybe he can't win. Maybe the situation on the ground is such that he'll never be able to fully control his whole country again. But as long as he's still alive and the people around him are still supporting him, that's a win for him. So the question is, what can be done to peel those supporters away? And that's, I think, where economic sanctions come in. That's where things like potential war crimes prosecutions come in. If a general in his army says, well, I don't want to risk being hounded across the world for the rest of my life, I'm going to abandon this guy. So those things can be powerful, but unfortunately none of them are a magic bullet. So he may have quite a bit of time left. Someone and now she's left, talked about the Arab-Israeli conflict. And I want to just spend a few minutes on that because I know it's something that comes up a lot, and it's a tough one sometimes to teach. I guess, this was the issue that I started my career on, and I came at it through the lens of identity and community and alternative narratives. And so you can embrace, if you have a student in the classroom who's bringing to the classroom either their religious views or their cultural communal identity, you can embrace that. And you can say, this is a narrative. And there are other people who come from other places who have an alternative narrative. And, without trying to judge between them, I mean, it's just like the blind man and the elephant, right? And so I think teaching about, not so much about rights and wrongs, but about narrative and experience and the specificity of human experience, and then about toleration, which is one of those really tough lessons. But it's one that I think young people are primed to learn because they have such a strong sense of justice. And if they can apply it to themselves and their friends, then they can also often extend it to others. And so teaching about toleration, and toleration meaning that, I can't get all of what I want if you're gonna be okay too. And I think too that there are stories from the Israeli-Palestinian arena that demonstrate the ability of humans to own their history but not let it define them, that can be helpful to bring in. And those would be stories like, I can't remember the name of the NGO, but it's an NGO of parents who lost children to terrorism, Israelis and Palestinians. I think it's called the Parents Circle. So that's one model you can bring in. There are a lot of projects in Arab-Jewish coexistence. One that I find really inspiring and that's rooted in bringing together three faith perspectives from Christianity and Islam and Judaism is Neve Shalom, Wahat al-Salam, which is a coexistence village in central Israel, where Christians, Muslims, and Jews live together and educate their children together, rooted in toleration and mutual respect. I think the biggest challenge probably is what source material do you use to teach the history? And, I think I'm not sure I have anything at the middle or high school level that I could immediately recommend. The books that I've used in the classroom are Mark Tessler's History of the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, which is long and detailed and footnoted, but eminently factual and balanced. And I've been begging him for years to do an updated edition because I think it's really valuable. Yes?
Somebody talked about choices program the other day, but there is a choices curriculum unit on conflict in the Middle East, and it does a really good job with this particular issue in terms of primary source documents and maps of changing sort of, maps over time and the UN partition plan and all of that. It's a really great curriculum unit. The other recommendation I do have is this video called Promises, which I don't know if you're familiar with Promises. But I use it often, and it has such a huge impact on kids. And it's basically the story told from the perspective of children on both sides of the conflict, who you see the indoctrination and the way they talk about each other without having had exchanges and met each other. And so the whole premise of the film is that they actually get these kids to meet each other. And they realize, oh, they're kids, we're kids, we all want the same thing out of life. And it's a really nice, touching kind of way to look at it. It's pretty well balanced, and it's perhaps a little bit more biased to one view, but it's probably the most balanced thing that I've come across.
What was the first one that you talked about?
The Choices program out of Brown University, Conflict in the Middle East, I think is the name of the program.
Okay, unfortunately I'm going to have to run in a minute, but any last comments, questions? Yes, ma'am.
I just want to say there's an app for Al Jazeera TV.
Yes, there is. You can watch it live, right?
Yeah, it's also on DirecTV.
It's the
Iran, it's not that there's no political competition in Iran, it's that the political competition is restricted to a very, very narrow band, and then everything else is beyond the pale, and you're not allowed to represent it. So there is competition among people who buy into the system of supreme guardianship and are willing to embrace, an autocratic state that imposes religious strictures on its population. But even within that, they have some differences of view. I think that's not where change is going to come from in Iran, from within that narrow band. I think it's going to come from the broad array of people who are excluded from that. Yeah, and unfortunately, those people haven't yet been able to organize in a way that's effective. And I've certainly heard Iranian dissidents say, how is it that the Tunisians, Ben Ali ran a police state, how is it that they were able to do that and we can't? So I think we're going to continue to see that bubble. Okay, well, thank you. This has been